Okay, well, I think we're live now. For those of you that are waiting, it's going to be a few more minutes before we start the broadcast, but welcome to the December webinar put on by the Florida FairTax Educational Association. But of course, it's available to anybody worldwide. Tonight's presenter will be Jade Wally. I'll introduce him at 8 o'clock when hopefully we get everything started here. I should have some background music or something going on. Again, it's 8 o'clock. This is Ron Malero. Thanks for attending the webinar tonight. We're doing it on a quarterly basis now. The presenter is Jade Wally. He's a CPA from Colorado, partner with a large firm out there, and relatively new to the FairTax, but he has studied it as much as anybody can, and has become a tremendous fan and asset to both the national organization and the. Sorry for the delay, folks. This is completely unexpected. We had a practice session the other day that went just fine. Everything worked very smoothly. Something has happened to Jade. I mean, he was getting ready with his PowerPoint. There, Jade is back. Okay. Jade, can you load your PowerPoint now?
There it is.
Yep, I see it. Okay.
All right. Oh, there we go. Okay, folks. Well, let's get started here. As far as logistics go in today's presentation, there is a question feature at the bottom where you can log questions, and we'll try to answer those. So I'm getting the message, folks, that some can hear me and some cannot. This is Jade Wally. You know, in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started here and take this over. So log questions if you have them, and let's get started. So today, on slide 3 here, you see what our agenda is. We're going to talk about a unique new idea. Not really that new if you're, running the circles of the MBA types, etc., but it's called the Blue Ocean Strategy. We're going to start out by setting the stage as far as our current situation with our corporate and individual income tax and payroll tax administered and enforced by the IRS, and then talk about this Blue Ocean Strategy, what it is, why it's great, and then talk about the FairTax from the perspective of this Blue Ocean proposition and see if the FairTax actually fits into what we call a Blue Ocean Strategy. And then we'll conclude with some Q&A. And we'll try to leave plenty of time there, even despite our 10-minute snafu at the beginning. So let's set the stage. What is our current situation? Currently, we have about $693 billion a year of illegal tax evasion. It's projected to increase to about $1 trillion a year by 2026, in part due to the new gig economy that we're all involved in. Currently, there's about 8.9 billion hours a year spent on complying with the U.S. tax code, and over 600 billion hours a year.
My voice is gone again now too.
And complying.
Get rid of those so you see the full screen.
Paid in large part to
only the co-host can see those.
Oh.
Let me type in there.
Where is it? Oh, there it is. What's that?
Okay, so moving on here, we've also got about 40% of our nation's treasury receipts currently coming from and being collected by the very regressive payroll FICA tax that even the poorest working Americans among us pay first before taking care of their family. This regressive payroll tax is the largest tax paid by 80% of all Americans. Currently, there are about 77,000 pages of IRS law, tax code, and tax court rulings and interpretations that make up the entirety of our U.S. tax code that each American is fully responsible for. With over 8 billion pages of forms and instructions each year, printed many times over, with at least 300,000 trees cut down each year just in relation to our U.S. tax code, And just one printing of all these forms laid end to end would stretch around the earth 28 times. So any good story here, as you can see, we talk about our current situation. Any good story, even if we go back to Goldilocks, it starts with what the current situation is. So we've tried to bring you in to what our current American situation is as far as our tax collection system. And most of you don't have to be brought in. You live it every day. Next, a good story, we'll talk about the complication, where to begin with our income tax system. The complication is that it's not working, and its effects on our economy, on our people, on our corporations, on us as small business owners is devastating. And then every good story will then lead in with a question. Well, what do we do? How do we overcome this foe, if you will? So that's the stage we're starting with here. And so let's go into what this blue ocean strategy really is. So a blue ocean strategy it's really a business concept, how to find a path into new market space. We can analogize this, though, in comparing tax systems and national treasury receipt mechanisms and what is the best. A red ocean is in business known as where you're fighting with supply and demand, and competition is fierce, and your products or services aren't that unique, and the water is bloodied from all the competition, all the sharks in the water. That's the red ocean, where most businesses really compete in. A blue ocean, on the other hand, is a niche or a new market where you don't have any competitors, and where you actually end up with lower costs and higher revenue. Sounds too good to be true, but it can be done sometimes, although it's not easy to do. The perfect example of trying to explain what this blue ocean is let's take Cirque du Soleil. Probably a lot of us have been to a Cirque du Soleil show at one point or another in our lives. If we take the traditional circus, attendance was dwindling, ticket prices were down, animal rights activists were all over the circuses as far as their treatment of animals and how inhumane it was. And you have Cirque du Soleil come along a few decades ago and completely upend. It's not necessarily a new invention, but they completely upended the circus industry. And if you take circus, what's the biggest cost? One of the biggest costs that Cirque du Soleil just chopped off, 30 to 40% of a cost of a circus out of the box, animals. So you have to house the animals, you have to train the animals, you have to feed the animals, you have to provide veterinary care for the animals, and transport all the animals. That cost was enormous and very inhibitive. Cirque du Soleil chopped that. The revenue model and the cost structure completely changed. Second, they brought in and made a circus something new. You might think of Cirque du Soleil as having elements of theater, ballet, Broadway, and not just the traditional circus, but it still does have the tent in many aspects of the circus. The clown, instead of slapstick, it turned into more sophisticated, funny humor at the beginning of the show, etc. Cirque du Soleil made this entirely new niche and executed a blue ocean strategy. And oh, by the way, the revenue went way up at the same time, with tickets more like $120 or $150, depending on your seat, compared to a circus at $35 or $40. So that's a typical or a prime example of what blue ocean is really about. So for the competition for the best revenue collection system in our nation, why is the FairTax great and actually greater relative to our current income and payroll tax system? So that's why we're here today, and that's what we're going to explore here. So does the FairTax, if we think about these three principles of a blue ocean strategy, does it break some or all of the rules? Does it pursue non-customers? And are the costs lowered while simultaneously increasing revenue? Again, this is very hard to do, but we're going to see if the FairTax actually does this. So let's move along here. So breaking some or all of the rules. So here's the first rule. You mean our income is not going to be taxed? How can that be? So the FairTax, and most of you probably know this, but for those who are new, is a national sales tax imposed only by retail businesses for the sale of new, not used, products and services, with the underlying principle that the national FairTax is collected once and only once at the retail level. This changes back the tax system to a model that promotes compliance rather than all but encouraging illegal tax evasion. If we go back to Adam Smith, the philosopher and politician, Scottish from the 1700s, he had a great quote about, which I think drives people to illegal tax evasion. He talked about the property of a person being uber important and uber sacred. What he talked about as somebody's most sacred property is the income that they earn. It's the very essence of one's own property. And even if you might not have a lot of other wealth and property, you have that income from your daily tasks or your employ. And that is viewed by humans, right or wrong, just the way our brains work, as the most sacred and inviolable. And so when we think about that, that's actually the way our current income tax system is composed. It actually takes lashes to us for earning income and earning that very sacred property that we call our own. Second, you mean our paychecks will not have FICA payroll taxes withheld? How does that work? So first of all, the FairTax ends payroll tax withholding. This regressive payroll tax for FICA, Social Security, and Medicare that are withheld from everyone's paycheck. Doesn't mean that those programs are going away. In fact, they're funded in the tax law and the fair tax law purposefully and intentionally. It's just not through this payroll tax anymore. So next you say, well, if we're going to a sales tax, isn't that regressive? So you eliminate the regressive payroll tax, but you're bringing on a regressive sales tax. And the brilliant thing with the fair tax is it has a prebate mechanism. And so it's fashioned and constructed to that very point to avoid regressiveness. And so what the prebate does, it basically reimburses you for your taxes spent on expenditures up to the poverty level. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So let's move on here. So breaking all or some of the rules, we currently have about 700 billion, 693 billion a year in tax evasion. That's about a 25% rate, if you think about that. The fair tax breaks that rule. No longer a 25% evasion rate. We're down to 2% as best as the studies show from a national sales tax. That is incredible. How can this be? There's about 100 million U.S. businesses. About 2.5% of those businesses, so 2.5 million, are retail. Of that, about 15%, about 375,000 businesses make up about 90% of the sales. So think Walmart, Best Buy, Costco, Amazon. These large retailers are not going to cheat. These large retailers, about 375,000 businesses, bring in 90% of new products and service sales revenue in the U.S. That is an immediate, out-of-the-box, much better position to be in from an evasion perspective. And if we think back, in financial circles, we think of the fraud triangle. What three elements are present anytime you have fraud? And definitely don't make any bones about it. Illegal tax evasion is fraud. It's intentional and it's theft. So the first thing you need with fraud being present, this fraud triangle, is opportunity. The second, rationalization. Some people call it justification. And then lastly, incentives and pressures. And so what right out of the box, the model of the fair tax is incredible because that rationalization and justification is gone because you're being taxed only when you want to be, when you make expenditures of new goods or services. Because your expenditures to survive up to the poverty level, they're reimbursed to you in the form of the prebate. So it's more of an optional model as opposed to the very essence of your property and your income being taxed, thinking back to that Adam Smith quote. And then lastly, the opportunity. The most important leg of that fraud triangle is the opportunity. You can rationalize and justify all day long. You can have incentives and pressures. But if you don't have the ability to open the cash register and take the funds, if that opportunity is not there, you can't steal. And that's what the fair tax does. You won't have 200 and 250 million individual tax collectors for the IRS. It's these 375,000 retail businesses. And they're not going to want to risk their state sales tax licenses on this. So breaking some of or all of the rules, what about, can we, right now, we certainly feel as Americans infringed upon by the IRS. We've all heard the horrible stories of civil asset forfeiture, and quite frankly, there's quite a bit of the Bill of Rights that are, worked around when it comes to the IRS and tax courts and tax law, that we actually don't get to avail ourselves of. So how does the FairTax break this rule? The IRS is completely eliminated and dissolved under the FairTax. And so here's some things that go away, some things that the IRS knows about you if you have a business and you file income tax returns. They know your income, how, from whom, and when. That's gone. They know your expenses, for your deductions, to whom and for what. That goes away. They know the type of car you have, how many miles you drove for work, charity, personal purposes. That goes away. They know your medical expenses. Medical expenses are deductible at a certain level on your income tax return. That goes away. They know whether or not you have health insurance, at least up until the individual mandate was repealed. They know your home size. If you have a home office deduction, your square footage, whether or not you own the home, its cost. The IRS knows your bank accounts. If you deposit any amount over $10,000, it must be reported to the IRS. They know the interest earned, whether you have foreign bank accounts, all must be reported. All of that goes away and it encourages freedom under the FairTax. They know your investments, your stocks, your bonds, your interest earned, your dividends received, your capital gains and losses. That goes away. They know the charities that you contribute to, which organizations do you support and for how much and when. And they know whether you're saving for retirement in college, how much you contribute each year to those savings, which organizations, and when you withdraw that money, and if they're qualified distributions, etc. All of that goes away. All of that, call it infringement on our freedoms as American, goes away. Definitely the old rule of the IRS being broken by the FairTax. So let's go to the next principle. Principle number 2 of this blue ocean proposition is, do you pursue non-customers? And again, this is coming from a business perspective, no doubt. But let's think about customers in the form of people who would remit revenue to our United States Treasury. Kind of align our brains with the tax system to that of a business. So first, we expand the tax base with the FairTax from 5 trillion to 9 trillion. How in the world does that happen? Simple thing. With income, you have one source of income, and that's from income. With spending, which would be the basis of a national consumption tax like the FairTax, spending comes from 4 sources. It comes from income, comes from borrowing, comes from savings, and if you have the gumption, it comes from theft. When thieves steal things, they go spend it. So spending comes from those 4 sources, which dramatically expands the tax base. Let's face it, the political reality now, no matter which side of the aisle anyone is on, is that you really can't tax the poor and the lower middle class anything or any more, and the affluent and the upper middle class will only produce up to a certain point of taxation. And with if you think about not only federal but state and property, you're definitely at that 50%, and in some states way above 50%. And you almost get to that level where the affluent say, listen, I'm not going to do this with a gun pointed to my head. And you reach these limits in our current income tax system where the tax base is stagnant. The golden goose has been strangled. The FairTax pursues non-customers, and we'll talk about it here in the next point. So folks in the United States illegally, right now, they're not paying a dime of federal income tax. They are consuming, and so under the FairTax, they will pay their full federal burden. One aspect of the FairTax is that the prebate that you get monthly to reimburse you for your taxes on expenditures up to the poverty level, if you're not here legally and don't have a social security number or otherwise here legally, you don't get the prebate. So if you're in the U.S. illegally, you're actually paying a much higher burden than U.S. citizens under the FairTax. So the FairTax actually encourages legal immigration. And when we talk about the economy here in a second, we're going to need more legal immigration than ever before, because the United States will be the world's tax haven with a 0% corporate and individual income tax rate. And so next there, you mean that the underground criminal elements of society will pay a full federal tax burden now? Yes, that's right. We finally figured out how to extract taxes from the oldest profession in the world. As people who partake in that profession go and spend, they're finally paying a full federal tax burden. There's many other elements of an underground criminal economy. As long as they consume and need to buy food, shelter, transportation, they will pay their full federal burden with the fair tax. So that's really wonderful. So now many Americans will pay their full federal burden who didn't do so previously. And also there's quite a few folks who, maybe either by habit, training, or the fact that their labor is being taken away from them, they find ways to justify not reporting their full income or ways to justify over-reporting deductions. I've talked to, different neighbors over the years in different places I've lived, and it's almost like a badge of honor if you can kind of cheat your way out. And I've seen that with small business owners, and it's sad, but that's part of the landscape that we're in. And so now another great thing with the fair tax is because, when you're doing things wrong deep inside, no matter how we've rationalized it, it chips away at our heart, our soul, our self-perception, and ultimately how we treat others and how we perceive our government. That gets changed because now you'll consume and you'll pay your federal burden. You won't even have the opportunity to stick your hand in the register, so to speak. And that goes a long way from taking the hazard out of play. If you're a golfer, you know that term. So number 4 here, the uber rich, they use tax shelters and other strategy to evade and avoid, sometimes legally avoid, income taxes. Will they finally pay their full federal burden? Well, right now, the uber wealthy, they don't pay Social Security and Medicare taxes. With the fair tax, they'll pay those taxes again. Currently, unless you're receiving a paycheck and a W-2, you're not paying the FICA payroll tax. The uber wealthy stopped earning paychecks many decades ago and live off dividends, earnings, and distributions as an employee. That goes away, and we pursue these non-customers under the fair tax. So let's go to the third principle under the fair tax: lower costs while simultaneously increasing revenues. Not very many businesses can get to this blue ocean strategy. Cirque du Soleil certainly did so, but it's very, very difficult. So $600 billion in annual U.S. company compliance costs. These are reduced to almost nil. There'll be some compliance cost. If you think about 100 million businesses in the U.S., 2.5% are retail that'll have to contend with collecting the sales tax like they do now in their states, remitting it to the state sales tax authority, and then that state sales tax authority remits it to the federal government for the fair tax. That $600 billion is a huge drag on U.S. companies in their costs that go into the cost structure that make the prices you and I pay for goods and services higher. And they make the employee wages that employees receive lower. And they make the dividends that owners and 401k holders receive lower. And they make the R&D and innovation initiatives have less investment. All these, that $600 billion in cost is eliminated. Let's think about GE. So I think a lot of people have heard that 2011 GE tax return example. It had 57,000 pages to complete its federal income tax return, corporate income tax return. And guess what? The tax liability resulted in $0. That is a huge example of costs that just go away. GE probably paid firms like mine and others millions and millions and millions of dollars to help their compliance efforts in that regard. Companies have employer payroll tax matching. That goes away. That's another cost. There will be floors of payroll and tax accountants that are really no longer needed and can be redeployed to help with new business initiatives and efforts. The cost of large companies' lobbying efforts is tremendous, with the income tax code currently is the second most lobbied area in Washington, D.C., second only to pharmaceuticals. With the fair tax, there's nothing left to lobby except the rate. And it will be worth noting that, if the fair tax, I'll say when the fair tax gets to the floor and it finally gets close to becoming law, there'll be temptation to, let's just exclude medicine or food. And then you get into opening the door to lobbyists. The fair tax was crafted and constructed in a way that was fair and simple and to keep out any kind of lobbyist. And the prebate eliminates all the needs to, exclude certain types of expenditures from the national sales tax. So we'll have to watch out for that when the time really does come. 8.9 billion hours Americans spend on tax compliance. That's cost. Does that go away? This time is a tremendous strain on millions of Americans, especially small business owners. And on average, Americans spend at least 30 hours a year filling out tax forms, with a much higher investment of hours away from family, friends, and their businesses for many millions. These corporate income tax costs paid by businesses move downstream in the form of higher prices to consumers, lower wages, lower investment returns, lower investment in business, such as R&D and other innovations. The Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office have data that shows workers effectively pay 1/4 of their business's corporate taxes. Other studies estimate workers bear upwards of 45 to 75% of the corporate tax burden. As of July 2018, over 3,000 U.S. businesses had raised wages or given bonuses, with the corporate tax rate going down from only 35% to 21%. Imagine a 0% corporate tax rate under the fair tax. Also, cost, time in the boardroom and arguing and strategizing on the most efficient tax treatment for various transactions and deals all goes away under the fair tax. That's actually one of the reasons the fair tax was started by three men in Houston back in the mid-90s. The incremental costs associated with the fair tax are extremely low. Let's think about, what will it take to administer? Most costs are already in place given each state's tax collection infrastructure already being there, along with virtually all vendors having point of sale systems in place to charge customers the applicable sales tax upon checkout. Let's go to the IRS. Ooh, where'd the slides go? Well, I'll keep on going here. One second. The IRS annual budget in employees, they're about 90,000. That $12 billion annual budget goes almost completely away. You'll have a sales treasury bureau that will have a little bit of cost associated with it. It will be minuscule compared to this $12 billion a year. Next, tax evasion. Tax evasion will be virtually eliminated. And this is a huge cost on our U.S. Treasury. Sales tax evasion studies to date indicate perhaps a ceiling where there may be a 2% evasion of sales tax. Listen, there'll always be some level of cheating as long as we have humanity involved in America and our tax collection system. The lawn guy might say, hey, just pay me cash. I won't charge you the fair tax. You can't have 100% compliance, but 2% maximum as opposed to 25% evasion now with $700 billion a year. That is an enormous difference in the cost. Enormous. I'm going to pause for a second and try to re-upload these slides here. There we go. Okay. So working poor. For our working poor, they immediately are hit with an obligation to pay the federal government almost 10% of their gross pay each week before feeding their family, putting a roof over their head, before buying milk, food, diapers, medicine. The U.S. payroll tax accounts for 40% of our U.S. Treasury's receipts, and it's the most regressive of all taxes, hitting our working poor extremely hard. Under the fair tax, the working poor keep their entire paycheck, and everyone keeps their entire paycheck. And they get all of their fair tax paid at the register reimbursed in the form of the monthly prebate for spending up to the United States Department of Health and Human Services annually determined poverty level. So for example, it's about $31,000 and change for a family of 4 in 2018. So here, if we think about it, let's say what the tax rate is let's just say 20%. 20% on 30,000, you're talking about $6,000 a year. And that's actually what you'd get back in a prebate. Of course, that'd be divided out monthly. But at the first of every month, that family gets their taxes they'll pay at the register on new goods and services reimbursed to them upfront. It's kind of like a standard tax deduction. So instead of 60% of Americans receiving a tax refund once per year, under the fair tax, everyone will receive a prebate of tax paid on expenditures up to the poverty level every month, everyone. So let's talk about other costs that go away here under the fair tax. We could really go on, and I'll just mention a few others. First, the invisible cost of business instability. It's eliminated under the fair tax. Businesses crave stability and predictability, especially when it comes to significant costs in their business. The lobbying costs mentioned previously result in multiple, often obscure changes to the tax code each year. During the current 115th Congress, even with the incredible tax reform enacted on December 22nd, 2017, there have been over 1,300 bills to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986. This constantly changing landscape is a significant cost for businesses of all sizes, and as explained in the original Fair Tax book, which I encourage you to read, has often led to companies going out of business. It is not unheard of. Under the fair tax, businesses can concentrate on their business. And of the 100 million US businesses, again, only about 2.5% are retail businesses selling to the end consumer. That means almost all businesses never have to worry about taxes again, since the fair tax is only charged once to the end consumer and not in business-to-business transactions. Additionally, businesses now have to deal with, on average, depending on the industry, about 22% of the total cost makeup of their product or service being comprised of embedded taxes based on Harvard Economic Department studies. These are the costs of employer payroll matching, corporate income tax, the costs paid to suppliers for their tax obligation on down the supply chain. Under the fair tax, almost all of this 22% of cost will fall out of the cost of their goods and services, meaning prices drop for everyone and everyone consuming these goods and services due to the efficient market concept of competition. This also means incremental business funds for employee pay raises, R&D, and higher dividends to owners and retired 401k holders. There's also societal cost of the intangible class warfare that is waged between different sides of the congressional aisle. That would go away completely under a simple fair tax that treats the working poor much better than the current regressive payroll tax. There's also costs of companies lobbying political action committee and those contributions. There's costs of waste and low recycling rates. You know, with the fair tax, purchases of used items will be significantly incentivized because the fair tax is only collected once when a new product or service is sold. The used market for autos, homes, and other gently used items will skyrocket, and the cost of the energy, time, and effort will be conserved at unprecedented levels, all while our environment benefits from an economy that will thrive on the highest rate of recycling ever known to humankind, really. The cost of education is also cut by about 40%, nearly half, under the fair tax relative to how we pay for secondary education under our current income tax system. Now, when we pay for college, we're using post-tax dollars, and the embedded taxes of the educational supply chain are a significant cost component of our universities and colleges that we pay for in the form of higher tuition and fees. Under the fair tax, all educational expenditures are considered an investment and are made completely free of the fair tax. And guys, this is the really only exception within the fair tax. Education is recognized as one of the strongest keys to economic prosperity and opportunity for Americans to advance their standing and station in life. And this, though, as you make those educational expenditures, they're completely tax-free. This will be one of the single biggest drivers, really, to an even more educated American workforce, which can be exported around the world to carry the torch of freedom, education, and advancement. There's also costs of lost productivity and the opportunity cost of time and effort that could be employed to solve problems, expand a business, cure cancer, finish a deal, or invest more time with your wife, your children, your husband, your friends, your coworkers. The list of cost savings could go on and on and on. And we've just touched on a few. So what about the revenue side? The fair tax is established at a rate that's revenue neutral. So it's not really a spending proposal. It's just if we bring in $10 into the Treasury now, the fair tax rate is put at a level that will bring in $10. So the answer here is, and if you understand, I'm not calling anyone stupid, but it's back in the 1990s, I think it was When Bill Clinton got reelected in 1996, some of the pundits said, yeah, it's not this, it's not that. The economy was doing good. It's the economy, stupid. So I'm not calling anyone stupid. I don't want to get letters. But revenues are increased under the fair tax because we're bringing in incremental non-customers, as we previously discussed, such as the illegal underground economy and people in the U.S. illegally, the self-employed business owners who may have been historically motivated to evade income taxes, and also tourists. Tourists are coming in, and they visit the U.S. in droves every year. I have a lot of them come visit me from different countries. And where the U.S., who arguably acts as the world's policeman in many respects and incurs huge military expenditures, they finally receive at least a partial reimbursement in the form of sales tax revenue from visitors. And based upon some of the finest minds, sounds like Ross Perot there, some of the finest minds, such as the former head of Harvard's economic department, they conservatively estimate that just in several years after fair tax enactment, that our U.S. GDP will increase by 10% annually. Can you imagine that? We are going gangbusters with a 3 and 4% GDP growth that many thought that we'd never hit again. The fair tax rate set, the 23% rate and originally contemplated here, does not contemplate this massive influx of Treasury receipts due to economic expansion, growth, new businesses being the world's tax haven, new jobs and employees, and new expenditures being made across the board. So when our economy is booming at such a clip, the Treasury receipts coming in will be dramatically increased. The great thing about this scenario is that the problem, air quote here, that our elected officials have to deal with is whether to lower the fair tax rate or use the excess funds to balance the budget in a single year, and after that, begin paying down our over $20 trillion in accumulated deficit. This is what we in the biz describe as a good problem to have. The uber wealthy here, second point, they'll also pay more. You know, right now the top 400 richest U.S. earners pay an effective tax rate of approximately 18%. And again, they're not paying payroll taxes. They are paying dividends, capital gains taxes. With the fair tax, they'll pay a much higher rate, and this is based on a Forbes study. Warren Buffett is famous for saying that his tax rate, not his tax actual contribution, but his tax rate is higher than his secretary's tax rate. With the fair tax, as Warren Buffett spends like a rich man, and although I understand he's very frugal in his spending, he'll undoubtedly spend a lot more than you or I in his day-to-day life, and he'll pay a much higher tax rate than his secretary. It's really simple with the fair tax. So let's say that Warren spends and consumes $1 million a year, a very conservative estimate given his wealth. And his secretary earns and also spends $70,000 a year. Given the prebate, Mr. Buffett's tax rate is over 22%, and his secretary's is 12.5%. So let's look at the math here. If you think about the secretary, she's getting a prebate. So if she's got a family of 4, her first $31,000 of spending is tax-free. So she's paying 0% on $31,000 of her $70,000 spending. On $31,001 up to $70,000, she'll pay a 23% rate at the register. That blends out, if you do the mathematics, to about a 12.5% blended rate at $70,000 of expenditures a year. Warren's rate will be not quite 23% because that prebate actually lowers that, but it'll be well over 22%, almost to 23%. And as the uber wealthy spend more and more millions, they get to that. You never get to 23.0% because of the prebate, but you get to 22.9999%. And so finally, what we have here is, Warren Buffett's rate is almost double of his secretary's. So the fair tax summarily and finally, once and for all, solves what I've affectionately coined the Warren Buffett secretarial tax rate conundrum. It's finally solved with the fair tax. So moving along here, wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and Q&A. We have another 15 minutes of time, and happy to pause and take any questions here. We can start reading them here. I got one question here on 12 billion, and I think they're talking about the IRS budget. What does that number represent? So 12 billion is out of our United States budget. that we seem to be in a fight with every 2 weeks to try and have a continuing resolution for spending. But out of our U.S. budget, $12 billion is allocated each year to the IRS, approximately, based on figures a couple years ago. That $12 billion pays for computers, infrastructure, employees, and other costs associated with running a massive organization with 90,000 to 100,000 employees, depending on the time. So that 12 billion would substantially be decreased under the FairTax. You will have a minor sales tax bureau, but under the FairTax, the great thing about it, the way it works, most of the burden of collection is at the retailer level and then at the state level, because the way the FairTax works, those Walmarts and Costco's collect it just like they do the state sales tax, remit the whole batch up to their state sales tax agency. The state then keeps their state sales tax, and then they remit the federal fair tax collected to the United States Treasury. It's really that simple. And so you will always, again, with humanity, there'll be some limited aspects of cheating. But again, I think, in my estimation, it'll be the lawn guys and maybe some small sole proprietors who don't have a state sales tax license. But here's the thing. If you do have a state sales tax license and you're a small business, guess what the state is going to begin expecting you to remit as you remit your state sales taxes each month or each quarter or each 6 months. They want the fair tax as well. And so that will be a very strong deterrent to evasion. We have another question here. Josh Maddox, do we have a chance against them, or are we barking in the wind? I always like to talk about how great things in life are difficult. The best things in life don't come easy, whether that's the great business ideas, whether it's holding marriage together. Let's think about things at a national level. In the early 1900s, before women's suffrage in the 1920s, and a constitutional amendment was passed to allow women the right to vote. You imagine how hard and how impossible that seemed for women in the 1800s and the early 1900s. I wish I had a dime for every time I bet someone told women who were interested in that movement, and men, a dime for every time I bet they heard, can that really ever happen? That'll never happen. That's too high of a hill to climb. No way. Let's think back into the space race and the Cold War after World War II, and when JFK said that we're going to send a man to the moon and return him safely. Do you imagine how difficult that was going to be, and how difficult it was, and how many people lost their lives trying to accomplish that feat? It was something great. It was not easy. I am unfortunately thinking that as we as Americans, we as humans, a lot of times we don't react, or we are reactive when bad things happen. So things, do we get out of our overspending and our lifestyles until another depression hits? Well, unfortunately, based on human nature and history, sometimes you need the roof to fall in before we really change our ways. I think as we get to that point closer and closer, by 2033, we're supposed to run out of the ability to pay for our Social Security and Medicare benefits. As we get closer, I think there'll be more pressure, and the fair tax will be looked at as a better solution. But our job here is to get into our congressmen and women's ears and let them know we want it now. We want to avoid the scenes like in Greece when people are on the streets and you needed massive austerity measures and all government benefits go away. Let's see, any other questions here? How many congressmen do you figure are actually discussing or moving, even the least bit, on fair tax? John Thomas, good question. I think in the last, this session we had about 50 or 60 congressmen who actually co-sponsored the Fair Tax Act, HR 25, which is really quite a bit amount. There's 435 congressional seats, and that's not a low percentage. Oftentimes you need them to be a little bit more vocal. So I think if every one of us, and we had about 10, 12, 15 people talk to each congressperson who had any inkling of maybe being a supporter, we would be that would be a grassroots movement that would get action immediately. And all it takes is like 10 people going to each congressman. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's hard to get us to actually mobilize and do it. I went and talked to my congressman here, and he actually lost this election. But he went and talked to the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee about the FairTax because I went and talked to him about it. I'm just this nobody in Colorado. And so they'll actually, if we take the time to do it, we will get movement. I'm confident. Another question: do you think the average American will look at this from the blended rate point of view, doing the math to get down to the lower effective rate after considering the prebate, or do you think there is potential for backlash based on people clinging onto the sticker shock of paying 23% at the register? Very good question, Eric. I think ultimately we have to trust that the truth wins out. We have to educate, and we have to show people that it's not complex math of how you get to a lower tax rate because of the prebate. It's actually fairly simple math, but I think it'll be demonized. I think it'll be demagogued because of that. And actually in various races in Florida, we've seen that people supporting the FairTax, their competitors, their opponents will demonize and say the people, they want to increase the price of everything you buy by 23%. Which is the furthest thing from the truth. First of all, embedded taxes fall out of the cost of everything you buy. Second, you get the prebate. And oh, by the way, you're keeping your whole paycheck because you don't have payroll taxes or income taxes, federal income taxes withheld on your paycheck. So if the full story is told, the FairTax supporters are supremely confident that the FairTax wins out because it's mathematically a better solution. But Eric's point is great, that you got to be prepared to battle the people who will demagogue, and a 7-second, 10-second soundbite can be made to sound very bad, and that's why we got to go deeper than 7 or 10 seconds. Phil says, might want to mention that studies show that the vast majority of retail sales tax takes place at the big box retailers, and they're not going to cheat. Yep. Talked about that point a little earlier, the Costco's, the Walmart's, the Best Buys. There's actually 375,000 businesses of the 2.5 million retail businesses that make up over 90% of U.S. Products and service sales. So 375,000 businesses. That's the vast majority of our U.S. Treasury receipts under the FairTax. You've got a very finite amount of tax collectors as opposed to now. You've got 100 million U.S. businesses and 200 million approximately individual U.S. taxpayers. You've got about 300 million tax collectors for the IRS right now. And then you go down to over 90% being represented by 375,000. So 300 million to a third of 1 million. That's astronomical as far as taking the opportunity to cheat away. Great point, Phil. Jag here makes a comment. I'm just a sole proprietor of a very small business, home business. Trying to be compliant is extremely time consuming and costly and infuriating. The more we learn that the IRS has no credibility with all the scandal it's drowning in. It's becoming increasingly more difficult to actually comply and work with an institution that is unavailable, ill-informed, and offers the worst customer service when I actually get an agent on the phone with me. I rarely get the same and consistent answer from the agents, and I have had several CPAs complete my tax returns for the same tax year, and all three came up with different net income and what I owed. You can't tell me that I'm motivated not to comply. It's just too darn complicated and expensive to comply. Great point, Jag. After I pay my CPA, I don't have any more funds to pay my IRS tax bill. I can't be the only one challenged by this. I trust it's likely the very reason why 49% of our population doesn't pay. How do we get politicians and IRS diehards to understand the benefits of the FairTax? Why doesn't the 3 Houston businessmen that have designed the FairTax and practice it in a mock-up fashion have more influence? Why haven't politicians like Mike Huckabee had more influence? Wish I had the answers to all of those questions, Jag. Great point. 2 of those 3 businessmen, I believe, have passed away now. The most recent was, if Ron had his voice, he could tell me, Bob McNair. Actually, one of the former owners of the Houston Texans was one of the original 3 that came up because they were decrying some of these reasons you bring up, Jag, but they had a larger business. And in the boardroom, they would spend 75% of the board meeting talking about what's the most efficient tax structure, as opposed to, does this deal make sense? Do I want to go in this line of business? What's going to be best for the economy, for my business, for my employees? etc. It infuriated them, and they actually didn't have the FairTax in mind when they started. It might be a different form of the income tax. They just hired economists, Harvard Economic. They spent millions of their own money to research and say, if we could start from scratch, what would be the best system? And the FairTax was birthed. It was the brainchild from that. So, Jag, it's great points on being a small business owner. I think you're spot on with everything, and it's a fair point. I think the system is set up that the IRS and our U.S. Treasury isn't collecting everything it should, and it's infuriating our customers. You're a customer, Jag, of the United States Treasury, or at least should be viewed as that, and it's not working right now. So great point. Let's see if there's anything else here. Keep the questions coming in. Breaking the income tax mindset. We have 3 generations since 1913 who have paid the income tax, mainly on income. How do we make them think outside the box? That's a good question. It really is. This is from Randy Fisher. It is so hard when you talk to people, especially about a consumption tax. You almost have to say, okay, here's where we turn our head sideways and we think outside the box. We're so programmed to think of an income tax. I think education is the key. Talking to our Congress people are the key. So, but it's a hurdle. It's an obstacle. Again, but Randy, I say the great things in life, which I think the fair tax would be for our country, I think would put us on an economic footing to survive as a country for another 100 years with prosperity. I single-handedly think the fair tax would do that. So it's a great thing. Great things aren't easy, and even the very people in America that this would help, even the lobbyists who decry the fair tax because they would lose their $500,000 a year jobs lobbying Congress on income tax items, they would benefit under the fair tax. So let's see here. By the way, it took the woman's vote about 100 years to finally hit. John Thomas. Great point. The fair tax was first introduced in 1999, so we're coming up on the 20-year anniversary. Let's pray and hope and work hard that the fair tax doesn't take 100 years to hit. And Phil says, as long as we expect the government to pick winners and losers, it's going to be almost impossible to tax ourselves in a way that's not perceived as complex and unfair. Great point. I think that's a great point. I love to go back on that point, Phil, and say, let's think about before the income tax came about with the 16th Amendment in 1913. Let's talk about all the great things that America did, and arguably some of the greatest things. The submarine was invented. Air flight was invented. The automobile was invented. And all of these things came about with, guess how much incentive from the income tax code? Goose egg, 0, because there was no income tax when all these things were invented. Arguably, when we think about the Industrial Revolution from 1776 to 1913, you had the most advancement in a 130, 40-year period than any other time in the history of mankind on Earth. And so to say that we need a group of politicians that, oh, by the way, are just normal people like you and I who all of a sudden are thought to become immensely more intelligent than you and I when they go to Washington, that they can decide and pick winners and losers. We've seen huge losses by taxpayers. If we think of this Solyndra example, $500 million of U.S. taxpayer money down the drain because of a government-backed guarantee for this solar company that went down the tubes. Now, so I think we've got to remind people of that. And really, this is grassroots. We need an outcry from people. In Congress, people will take action if we put pressure on them. That's the only thing that drives them. So I encourage us all. Let's all make a pledge to get about 10 people, including ourselves, to go talk to our respective congressperson about the fair tax. Oh, what else do we have here? Kenneth Holyfield, everyone I talk to, no one knows about this. Well, let's spread the word. Okay. Let's see. John Thomas, one last. I think they'll be forced to scrap it, Jay. The evasion plus the outrage over slacker burden shift to regular taxpayers will become too much. Maybe so. Where we're about at the top of the hour, apologies on the first 10 minutes. We had a little bit of a snafu there. We are using a new platform. We're trying to get the kinks worked out. Our practices seem to go better than the live version. So special thanks to Ron and Elaine Malero. They are instrumental in getting this platform up and running and helping with a lot of the logistics and are great. So, and thanks to Randy Fisher as well. Great input and help in the whole process. Let's see this. David Swift, see my comments on a national conference. Let me try to find your comment. Oh, I don't see your, David, I don't see your comment. Apologies. I'm scrolling on the right in the chat bar. But I will definitely try and take a look on that, David. On a national conference, I don't think that's a bad idea at all. And I encourage us all, any of us who have a speaking platform. I'm asked to come back to my alma mater, Oklahoma State, and teach a graduate practicum course, 2.5-hour course once a year. Guess what my topic is every time? FairTax. And I educate 30 accounting students about the FairTax. And at the end of the class, I always ask, and I try to do it from a neutral perspective, pros and cons, but the pros vastly outweigh the cons, obviously. And at the end of the class, we ask for hands on who thinks the FairTax is a great idea. And keep in mind, some of these students are going into practice with a focus in tax accounting. And virtually 90% of the hands go up saying, this is a great idea. So I say, let's use our venues that we have. Yeah. So, hey, we'll close down for now. We're kind of at the top of the hour. Really appreciate everyone's attendance. Let's get out there. Let's make this happen. And if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to Randy, Ron, myself. And we'll be doing these webcasts every quarter. And look forward to your attendance. And, it goes without saying, we should pause and say Merry Christmas to everyone. Let's not forget the reason for the season. And if you're not Christian, happy Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever you are. Really appreciate everyone being involved here and your interest in the FairTax. We're signing off for now. Merry Christmas, everyone. Take care.